Good morning. My name is Lorraine Jacobs, and Mark Miller and I are co-chairs of the Sunday Morning Forums. We welcome and thank you for supporting Sunday Forums. For over 50 years at First Unitarian Society, Milwaukee, the Sunday Forum Lecture Series has showcased speakers. Forums are 1 hour in length and provide a presentation followed by questions. Scheduling and hosting these weekly programs is accomplished by volunteers. The presenters do not receive honoraria. The content of each forum may not always align with the viewpoint of First Unitarian Society Milwaukee. They are meant to offer topics which can be pursued further independently. Before we begin today, I'd like to remind you that next Sunday, April 24th, our topic will be Voces de la Frontera with our speaker, Christina Newman Ortiz. And today we welcome Deja Garner of WAVE, and she'll be introduced by our host, Dan O'Keefe.
Good morning. I'm happy to introduce today's forum's speaker, Deja Garner. Deja is the Director of Equity and Outreach at the Wisconsin Anti-Violence Effort, WAVE Educational Fund, a grassroots gun violence prevention organization in Wisconsin with an emphasis on evidence-based solutions to gun violence for impacted communities. Her work involves developing and managing community projects that emphasize youth involvement, harm and violence reduction, criminal justice reform, and equity issues. Deja also specializes in equitable gun legislation and the racial implications of federal, state, and local gun policy. She will share her personal and professional perspectives on police violence and police reform. Welcome, Deja.
Thank you for that introduction, Dan. And thank you to those of you who are tuning in both in person at the church, hello, and virtually online. I'm really excited to give this presentation to you all. And so at one point in my life, I didn't even want to say or hear the word gun. I saw guns as not only an object of destruction in a deadly sense, but an object that tore lives and families apart on both ends of it. Now, unfortunately, guns are a regular part of my daily conversation, and I struggle and grapple with the fact of what they are capable of. My name is Deja Garner, and I am the Director of Equity and Outreach at WAVE Educational Fund. WAVE is a nonpartisan, statewide grassroots organization dedicated to preventing gun violence, injuries, and deaths through education and advocacy. I do work at a gun violence prevention organization, but that is not what qualifies me to appear before you today. Long before my work with WAVE, I became an expert on the pervasiveness and devastation of gun violence. I appear before you as a person who has lost over 25 people that I personally knew to gun violence. Just a few years ago, I lost a very close friend of mine to a situation that still keeps me awake at night. During the 2 years that I have been at WAVE, I have been personally connected to at least 8 people who died to gun violence, including 2 of my former students. You may think that over 25 people is an unbelievable number. However, I am 28 years old currently, and although I don't remember whether or not death was an aspect of my early childhood, I do know that my most formative memory of death was around 2nd grade. Each year since then, it seems as if gun violence follows me. I'm sorry to take the conversation in this direction, but it always feels as if death is near. Every time someone says, "Hey, do you remember such and such?" My heart sinks because my very first thought is that they have died. Every night when I am shaken out of my sleep because of the sound of bullets, I fear that in the morning, I will get a phone call that it was somebody that I knew. Even more painfully, I have this nagging fear that one day my own life will be taken by a bullet. I have had close encounters, but I have been spared each time. But it's painful to feel as if one day I won't be so fortunate. Aside from this theme of knowing victims of gun violence, my very own father spent 23 years in prison for an action committed with a gun. As a result, I was raised by a single mother who created a wonderful life for me and put me on a positive path. But one thing she could not shield me from was the reality of gun violence. I was 6 years old when my father went to prison. And as a result, even if my life turned out in a way that I didn't know any victims of gun violence, my life would have still been deeply impacted by the issue because of the absence of my father. Again, over 25 people may seem like an unbelievable number. I am not in the military. I do not spend my time around guns, and I do not know many people who personally do. So how did I end up having so many connections to these incidents? The simple answer is, I don't know. Sometimes I feel as if God is testing me somehow or preparing me for something. I just don't know what it is. What I do know is that unfortunately, I am not an anomaly. I know many other people who have a story that is similar to mine. I know young people who have held guns. I know people who have had guns pointed at them. My background is in education, and I can't even begin to tell you the amount of gun-related stories that I've heard from young people. One of the most chilling situations that I remember was when a young person who was maybe 9 years old at the time had on layers of thick clothing in the summertime. Imagine looking out on the playground and seeing a young person with a full sweater jogging pants combination and it's 80 degrees outside. When asked why he had on such thick clothing, do you want to know what he said? He said that he wore such thick layers so that the bullets wouldn't hurt as bad. I also remember very vividly being at home in bed one day and hearing a pop that sounded like it was right next to me. I looked outside my window and I wished that this story was untrue. And I saw 3 children, small children, with a gun. Not a handgun, but a long gun. They found the gun and shot it by mistake. The bullet hit the house directly next to mine. It entered the house at the same height of my bedroom window. A few feet could have changed the trajectory of that bullet. I later found out that the children were following a stray cat into a gap underneath a porch. And instead of finding the cat in their curiosity, they found an irresponsibly stored gun. The final story that I will share with you is a conversation that I had with a student who joined WAVE for a youth group discussion. One of the questions that we posed to the students was if they felt safe in their neighborhoods and safe in their homes. One student responded and said at one point she did feel safe in her neighborhood. Oh, we also asked if they felt safe in their schools. And her response was that she did feel safe in her neighborhood. And at one point she did feel safe in her school. However, she started to feel unsafe when she heard about some of the legislation that was happening in Wisconsin. Initially, I was shocked because it is not every day that you hear a young person talking about legislation, especially not wanting to join a conversation to talk about legislation. She then went on to tell me that she did her own research and wanted to figure out how she could help figure out the problem. This student is 15 years old. Children should not have to feel the burden of responsibility of fixing the mistakes that we make as adults. And they definitely shouldn't have to lose their sense of safety because of those mistakes. I could go on for hours about loss, violence, fear, and sadness, all related to gun violence. I know many people who have lost their loved ones to gun violence, and I know many people who have been shot and survived. With this in mind, I want to share the reality of the problem with you. Can everybody see that? I hope so. All right. So before we get started, I'd like to go over some norms. There are parts of this presentation that will be uncomfortable. There are parts of this presentation that make me feel uneasy and uncomfortable. But that does not mean that this conversation is unsafe. The second norm is to expect and accept non-closure. What that means is that I would try my best to provide as much information as I can regarding the topic, but I do not know everything and I can't possibly cover everything in the time that we do have. So that brings me to the final norm, is that if you have questions, we will have an opportunity at the end for people to ask some questions, but then I also will provide an email at the end of the presentation. And if you have a question for me or just a question regarding gun violence in general, we will try to get back to you with a solid answer if there's something that I can't answer today. So when it comes to discussing gun violence, I find it helpful to look at it by comparing the United States with some other countries, then looking a little bit at Wisconsin, and then finally looking at Milwaukee with a great bit of detail. So the United States has a firearm homicide rate that is 25 times higher than 22 other high-income countries combined. Those 22 countries are not reflected here in that chart, but we do have a copy of that chart if you would like to see it. Also, when looking at 23 high-income countries, including America, 82% of all firearm deaths occurred in the United States. And if I pause a little bit, during these slides, that's just to give people an opportunity to look at the graphic. Americans are 25 times more likely to die from gun violence than residents of peer nations. And when you look at gun ownership in this country, the United States has the highest rate of civilian gun ownership. And so again, keep these numbers in mind as we continue with the presentation. The truth of the matter is that there are more guns in America than there are people. Our rate of gun ownership far exceeds many other countries across the globe, and easily accessible firearms put us at risk year to year. In some instances, it is easier to get a gun than it is to register to vote, get a driver's license, or open a bank account. Looking at 2020, we saw historic numbers of handgun purchases. While the gun industry continues to profit off of fear and death, communities continue to be ravaged by gun violence. This brings me to the point of talking about American gun culture. Guns are a deeply ingrained part of our society, and we are one of very few countries that includes gun rights as part of their constitution. We find that guns are threaded throughout popular culture, and they can also be found in great numbers in both metropolitan and rural areas. I found several instances online where the United States of America was inappropriately mocked by other countries because of its incidence of gun violence. We are far behind in many regards in comparison to countries that have drastically lower rates of gun violence. With this in mind, let's take a closer look at the impact. According to Brady, around 117,345 people are shot either fatally or non-fatally in the United States each year. The United States made history in 2020. According to the CDC, we lost 45,222 people to gun violence in 2020. This is the highest number that we have on record. Next, we will talk about risk. And I will just say that none of this is easy to discuss, but looking at these numbers in particular are difficult for me. So please bear with me as we get through this together. I also want to thank WAVE's executive director for assisting me by providing this data. I know that the reality of gun violence breaks her heart too. This is how the number of firearm deaths is broken down by type. As you can see in the blue here, that is the number of suicide deaths in 2020, and the yellow or gold is the number of homicides. There are also numbers for legal intervention, unintentional deaths, and some deaths that were undetermined. Now we will look at a breakdown of these numbers by gender using the gender classifications currently utilized by the CDC. So when we look at male versus female firearm deaths in the United States in 2020, the numbers that you see represented in blue on the furthest left bar would be suicide, and the blue ones are for male, and the female are in it's in gold. So for all of these, it will be male blue and then female will be gold. And as you can see, this blue is pretty large. Again, with homicide, we're seeing a bit of the same thing where we have a fairly large blue bar for males. This is a breakdown of firearm suicide rates by age. For today, we will look at white males versus black males. In blue, the bars represent white males. For the most part, you will see that the blue bars are larger or have greater numbers in each age range, except for in the age 20 to 24, you will see that the gold bar is actually a bit more than the blue bar. And again, the blue bar would represent white males and the gold bar will be represented by black males. And I will say this, some numbers will say that we're seeing a bit of a decrease or have seen a bit of a decrease in suicide over the past few years. That decrease has been happening in nearly, in lots of demographics. However, for the Black population, suicides are actually increasing at an exponential rate, particularly for Black youth. This next graphic here, again, this is one that absolutely just devastates me. But this is a representation of the firearm homicide rates by age, broken down again by white males versus Black males. The blue bar again would represent white male homicide rates, and the gold bar would represent the homicide rate for Black males. And again, I realized that these numbers are difficult to see, particularly for some folks who may identify as a demographic that is represented here. And so I, also want to say that again, any of these statistics are really, really difficult to hear. And so I want to give us an opportunity to pause for a moment here and take a moment to breathe, and then we will continue the presentation. Of those 45,222 deaths that we saw related to firearms in the United States, 631 of those gun deaths in 2020 were right here in Wisconsin. And again, I'll be sure to pause just in case anyone just needs to take some time with these statistics or would like to write, some notes. Looking at Milwaukee specifically, we had historic numbers of homicides. So when I say homicides, that doesn't necessarily mean that they were just gun-related homicides. So this number here that we see, this 190 homicides in 2020, is inclusive of all types of homicides. However, a great percentage of those were due to gun-related incidents. And so we hit a record in 2020. And then the following year, in 2021, we unfortunately beat that record. And we ended with a number of 197 homicides in 2020 in the city of Milwaukee. So, what causes such devastating amounts of gun violence or violence in general at all levels in this country? These are some of the root causes of gun violence. Many communities that are disproportionately impacted by gun violence have gone underfunded and under-resourced for years. So as you can see, some of the causes here are structural racism, concentrated poverty, underfunded education systems, hopelessness, segregation, which includes redlining, voter suppression, lack of access to recreation, and a number of others. This creates a cycle of violence that calls for some type of intervention to break it. Again, how does this look in Milwaukee? So in the background here, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but in the background here, there is a redlining map. And if anybody's unfamiliar with the term redlining, essentially there were grades given to neighborhoods, and according to those grades, so this was many, many years ago, but according to those grades, that is how loans were given to people. And so if a particular neighborhood, as you can see here, would have like a D for a grade, then there would not be an opportunity for a person to get a loan from the bank because of the neighborhood that they lived in. And unfortunately, that isolated many Black and brown people from being able to own homes. And so moving a little bit forward in time, but unfortunately not too forward in the way that the racial breakdown looks in the city of Milwaukee. This map here it represents the diversity or lack thereof in the city of Milwaukee. So if you look at the blue represents the white population. If you look at the green represents the Black population. If you look at the orange, or some people may see that as like a goldish color, that would be the Hispanic population. Red is the Asian population. And then you also will see some brown here, which represents a multi-race population. And so again, I'll just let us sit with this map and try to remember this map as I move forward throughout this presentation. So when we look at household income versus homicides in Milwaukee, this is those statistics represented in a graphic form, or again by a map. So if you look at the income, the deepest red is equivalent to the lowest income. And then if you look at the homicides in Milwaukee, the deepest red is equal to the highest number of homicides. And so the point of showing these graphics, in addition to some other ones that you'll see, is just to show that there is a correlation to some of the things that we see as it relates to gun violence and some of the other things that we might not always think about. So things such as home ownership or income having a direct correlation to the number of homicides that we might see in a community. So when ice cream sales increase, so does violence. Why? That is the question. So I'll give everybody kind of a moment to think about that, sit with that. And now I'm going to show you all another map. This is a map of areas that experience excessive heat in the summertime. And so again, if we look at some of the areas that are in the deepest red, those would be the areas that experience extremely excessive heat. So this is a heat map of the city of Milwaukee. And although I did ask for everyone to remember what these maps looked like, I thought it would be helpful to see all of them together. I put the homicide map in the middle, the race map, or the racial, the demographics of Milwaukee are on the top left. The excessive heat map would be the top right. The redlining map is the bottom left, and the household income map is the bottom right. As you can see, there is a correlation between all 5 of these maps. And again, the point of this is to try to draw some lines between rates of gun violence and some other factors that we might not traditionally think about when we think about causes. This part also is difficult. I will not read each of these headlines. However, these are news titles or news stories that are, some of them are fairly recent. So as recent as 2020, I see 2021 here, 2019, there's one from 2014, but essentially it is a representation of Wisconsin and the disparities that exist when it comes to racial inequity, and then also Milwaukee. One of the, well, two of the most devastating things for me was the fact that at one point, Wisconsin was the worst state in the country to raise a Black child. And the second one is the fact that Milwaukee and Racine, they were ranked at one point #1 and #2 as the worst city for African Americans in the country. So the question becomes, what else are we up against when it comes to solving gun violence? Here in Wisconsin, some legislators continuously push for dangerous gun legislation, such as an attempt to lower the age of concealed carry, or a bill that would allow for permitless carry. Organizations like WAVE and many others work day and night to try and make sure that these kinds of dangerous bills do not get passed. Outside of Wisconsin, just last week, we saw a gun-related tragedy in a New York subway, and on that very same day, we saw the governor of Georgia sign a law that would allow for what they call constitutional carry. This legislation allows for those who can legally own guns as defined by Georgia law to conceal and carry a handgun without a permit. Every day, we are up against individuals who want nothing less than for guns to be easily accessible and freely carried anywhere, although we know that that puts lives at stake. It is not every day that we are able to block these things from happening, but there are those glimpses of hope when we do. This is the part where we get to celebrate a little. In Wisconsin, Governor Evers recently vetoed a package of dangerous bills, including one that would allow firearms in vehicles on school grounds. We also recently saw that President Biden took action against ghost guns, which are guns that are untraceable, and nominated a new director of the ATF. These are huge wins for gun violence prevention, even though there is still more work to be done. I encourage you all to do some additional research on these successes. So the question that we posed at the very beginning, the title slide, is gun violence preventable? The short answer is yes. So as an organization, WAVE sees preventing gun violence as something that needs a multifaceted approach. We look at 3 focus areas when it comes to solutions. We look at things from a personal level, a societal level, and a community level. You may know WAVE as a policy organization, but we do much more than that. So on a personal level, WAVE provides research-based information to its audience. So we do presentations like these. And we also highlight how certain risk factors elevate the likelihood of harm when a weapon is readily accessible. We do work from a policy end, and we push for equitable gun legislation in addition to common sense gun laws, such as background checks on all gun sales, which is supported by gun owners and non-gun owners alike, and laws such as ERPO, which are extreme risk protection orders. These orders temporarily remove firearm access in situations where a danger is posed to oneself or others. These protection orders have contributed to a reduction in suicide rates for many states that have implemented them. Also, as part of our societal level work, we work tirelessly to make sure that the gun industry is held accountable and is regulated. To follow up on that, as I was preparing for this presentation with our executive director, she shared a story with me about what someone told her regarding WAVE's impact. They said, you know, because of WAVE, Wisconsin is the only gun-friendly state where the NRA can't get whatever the NRA wants. That, I hear clapping. Thank you. That speaks volumes, not just about the organization's work, but the power of those of you who work alongside us. Finally, at a community level, we approach gun violence in a way that we see how important and imperative it is to work together. We work with partners both nationally and locally to ensure we are seeing all of the connections to gun violence and the solutions to it, including addressing disparities in social determinants of health for impacted populations. This work also forces us to take a deep look at the racial implications of gun violence and to promote racial equity as a solution. With all of this said, you may be wondering what you can do at this very moment. And so these are things that you can do at a personal, societal, and community-based level. Personally, you can make decisions about your own relationship with guns. There are statistics that prove that having a gun in your home increases the likelihood of a lethal incident in several different situations, such as suicide and domestic violence. As far as the societal level, it is important to engage in opportunities that we have to participate in the system, including research-based voting and engaging with our legislators. Another thing is that, in my opinion, culturally, we have to change the narrative around guns. Historically, gun ownership was one of the ways to prove how powerful you were in American society. This is also a notion that continues to be backed by the gun industry. This doesn't have to be the case anymore, and we can continue to push for the gun industry, both manufacturers and sellers, to be regulated and held accountable for their role in this issue. There are also community-based models and interventions that you can research and support. There are community-based intervention models, hospital-based intervention models, and school-based intervention models. There are also, again, local organizations such as WAVE that are working tirelessly to save lives. I encourage you all to get connected with a gun violence prevention organization that can provide some of the tools and resources you need to mobilize yourself against this issue. Finally, we understand that our country has a deep, dark history as it relates to racism. And the only way to reach a place where we all can feel liberated and safe is to dismantle the systems that allow for white supremacy to thrive, fueling the harms of gun violence. At times, I have to admit, I get a bit discouraged. You all may be able to imagine how deflating it is to work on this issue day in and day out and to hear about a new shooting incident almost every day. People look to individuals in this work as a guide, but truthfully, to make any progress, it takes all of us, especially survivors of these senseless tragedies. Before I close, I would like to share just a few more statistics with you. So, I titled this You Are Not Alone because sometimes it can feel very isolating to care about this issue, but there are over 150 gun violence prevention organizations across the country. And I also looked at a report of gun legislation and firearm provisions across the United States. And since 1991, there has been a notable increase in provisions across the United States. We still do have a lot of work to do, but it gives me hope to know that there are people who are working on this issue. Also, our young people care deeply. This photo is from our 2021 summer internship. We received over 40 applications and had to narrow the group down to a manageable number of 15. With that said, you can't imagine how exciting it is to know that so many young people are passionate about this issue and want to see a better tomorrow. There is not a single way to tackle gun violence. There are several. We are up against a well-funded machine when it comes to the gun industry, but personally, I don't believe that there is any amount of money that can outweigh the value of human life. I am thankful that there are people such as yourselves that would agree. Step by step and brick by brick, we can begin to change community norms, dismantle problematic systems, advocate for adequate resources in underserved communities, and work to destroy many of the structurally racist practices that got us here. If you care deeply about this work, please know that you are not alone. I appear before you as an individual who has been crushed by gun violence in many ways, but my hope and passion for this work remains unwavering. I always like to end with this. Gun violence prevention is an act of love. Thank you all for your time, and thank you for opening your hearts to this issue.
Good job.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Deja.
Absolutely.
There were at least, we had through the morning at 10, 12 people here in person. So just so you know.
Good.
Yeah,
I can hear the thunderous applause.
Yeah, I know you can't see us, but thank you so much.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you all for being here. We truly appreciate it.
Let's see if we have any questions. So let's see. Anybody has questions?
The question I have, Deja, is I've never seen that statistic of heat, the heat measure of a neighborhood. Can you tell me more about that, how that's determined and what contributes to that?
So like what the connection is?
Yes.
Sure. So, I think that there are a number of different factors in addition to heat that correlates between, that makes that number make sense or makes that map make sense in correlation to gun violence, right? So when we look at a city like Milwaukee, one again that is severely under-resourced, there is an extremely high amount of concentrated poverty as we saw in one of the other slides. And then we take something like heat, which is an extremely exhaustive element, right? It's something that in order for it to be combated, lots of people might use like air conditioning or something like that, but there are some areas of the city who that don't get relief from those extreme measures of heat, right? And so again, just being in a really concentrated area with several other stressful factors heat is just one of another stress element that adds to that mix and adds to that pot. And causes elevated levels of gun violence. And this is not something that is exclusive to Milwaukee either. You can also look at heat maps in other cities across the country. And I say cities specifically, because typically you find that in cities, houses are kind of bunched together. People are kind of, on top of each other when it comes to proximity. But if you look at heat maps across the country, you can see that there are also correlations in other cities too.
Thank you.
How can we access?
She can hear you.
How can we access that slideshow that you showed us?
I think we should be able to share it somehow. We'll figure it out on the back end, how we can share it out to folks who'd like to see it. I said I was going to provide an email and I didn't, so I can quickly do that. I'm going to share my screen one more time.
Let me just say while you're doing that,
Sure.
we will be recording this forum on the church YouTube channel, so people can see that and use that to access your video too.
Okay, that sounds great. And this is also our contact information for WAVE. And so if you would like a copy of the slides, then feel free to email us and we can try to get that to you.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Yeah, just wanted to make sure I shared that. I didn't share that before.
Okay, Dennis.
So Deja, thank you so much for this presentation. I think it would have been a better presentation for Good Friday than on Easter Sunday, but it really touches one to hear about the amount of gun deaths that you have suffered from in your life. And, it's just a totally different experience than from my world. So thank you for presenting this. I have a question. We always hear about the number of deaths, but I'm wondering about the cost of for the hospitalizations and so on for the many people that are injured, and the effects of the families for somebody that's been severely injured and in the hospital for a while. Do you have any statistics on that?
That's a great question. And I am sure that many of my coworkers would be surprised that I didn't include that, because that was information that was kind of readily available for me to do. But we see that there's a cost of about $280 billion per year related to gun violence. So that could include, like you said, hospitalization, loss of wages, like for companies who have employees who are victims of gun violence, that kind of thing. But yeah, about $280 billion per year. That's a great question, Dennis.
Dan, did you have another question?
I wanted to ask, the statistics point out that it's males do the shooting and the suicide. I was wondering, you had the slide regarding you shared how you had 40 applicants, and the video had almost all girls. Are you having a good gender representation among the youth?
Oh, so you mean with the summer internship program?
Yes.
Yes. So we find that for whatever reason, and this is actually something that we are doing some of our own research in trying to figure out how we can better, maybe change our recruiting strategy or something like that. Just trying to figure out what will give us a greater connection to all genders, right? But you will see that We did have many interns who identify as girls or women. And yeah, statistically, though, we do know that the demographic that is at the highest risk for homicide is, Black men. And so we are trying to figure out if there are ways that we can do things differently to make sure that we're connecting with the demographic and population of people who are truly affected by this issue. With that said, with suicide numbers, we know that those numbers affect, again, as you saw in the slides, white males at a really high rate. And so we're also, trying to figure out if there are things that we can do differently to reach out to that segment as well. But that was a good catch that there was a little bit of a lopsided representation of gender in our internship program, but that's definitely something that we are working on.
Appreciate the presentation.
Absolutely.
It's very awesome. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Looks like Dan had another thought. Come on, Dennis. Sorry, Dennis. Did you have something more?
Yes,
Okay, great.
I see you even had a dog there that looks like is signed up for your course.
Yeah.
I guess dogs get pretty frightened by gunshots.
Well, that actually was a photo of one of our interns that was a little bit camera shy. And although it is a dog, I don't like to leave, that person off when it comes to the photo. So I always include the dog there.
I was wondering how it got in there.
Yeah.
I've been very interested in this topic for a long time. My dad committed suicide with a gun.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that.
Turned 75, so it's an important issue. But I wrote an article called "Guns in the American Psyche," and it was published in the Journal for the Anthropology of Consciousness, a special issue on militarization in America. And I can put that article up on our in the chat box here. But my question is, though, do you see much hope for like reducing the number of guns in America? I know in Australia, after some terrible gun incidents, they managed to, I think, call in a lot of or most of their guns, but it seems like it's been a pretty impossible thing to undertake here in America. Any thoughts about that?
That's a great question and a great observation, and like I mentioned in the slides and just in my research in general, there are lots of guns in this country, over 300 million guns. And when I looked at some of the different ways that the government hasn't attempted in the past to get some of those weapons back, so like buyback programs and things like that, those haven't been hugely successful. So when it comes to my hope for reducing the number of guns that we have in America currently, I'm not sure, how I would answer that question in a way that wouldn't be, completely devastating. But I do think that moving forward, we can definitely change, again, some of those regulations as far as manufacturers go, as far as sellers go, and being able to kind of regulate the ways that weapons can technically, be used. And then in addition to that, just changing, again, some of those factors that influence interpersonal gun violence and rates of suicide, where guns won't be utilized or mishandled in ways that they shouldn't be. I think in other countries, you will see that there are some high rates of gun ownership, not as high as the United States, but in other countries, you'll see that there are also guns present, but there aren't some of the factors that we see existing in this country that causes such high rates of gun violence. So your initial question was if I have any hope for reducing the number of guns that we have in America. I'm not quite sure how we would do that. So that's where a little bit of my that's a question mark for me in my head, but I do think that we can change the way that we view guns and change the way that guns are used in certain incidents in the country. But that's another great question, Dennis. Thank you for asking that.
I just have one question, and then this is Lorraine, and then maybe it would be time for you to have a closure and we can be done. But I was wondering about, does WAVE work with the military at all, especially the Veterans Administration, with the many guns that come home with veterans and the mental health aspects of their return? Is there a conversation with the military at all?
I think so. We do have, so the military is a function, obviously, of the federal government, right? And so we do have conversations at a federal level, which includes some implications for the military. One number that we do know is that, again, suicide rates, this stuff is really, it just hurts to talk about, but suicide rates for our veterans is extremely high. And so when we do a lot of the work and when we look at a lot of like the policy and the changes we'd like to see on a mental health front, I think that our military is a huge part of that, and WAVE definitely does have conversations that would include the military as far as veterans bringing their weapons home or owning guns. I think again, the point of the information that we try to provide is just to give people enough information to make well-informed decisions for themselves. But we don't say whether or not people should or should not do certain things. We just try to provide the best information that we can as far as risk factors. And so exposure to violence, and oftentimes that does happen in the military. Exposure to violence is a risk factor that increases the likelihood that a weapon may be misused, in an incident down the line. And so all we can do really is kind of provide information and work with organizations that do a lot of the direct service work, and try our best again to let people kind of make informed decisions regarding gun ownership.
Thank you, Deja. That was, as all of your talk today, very thoughtful and sensitive. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the question.
Thank you. I'm going to be ending now, and
Okay.
we'll be stopped.
All right.